Okay, now we're leaving Paleolithic art for Mesolithic art. And this Mesolithic time period, we're not going to spend very much time here. We're going to focus a little bit more on Neolithic following this. But this intermediary time referenced in our text with this image here, it covers roughly 7,000 through 4,000 before the Common Era. And here we see the marching warriors. And this is a time, kind of a transitional stage when the climate grows warmer and you see more representation of themes of hunting, harvests, battle, dance, and ritual, as we see here with marching warriors. And these figures are portrayed in this rhythmic, kind of expressive style with very kind of dynamic shapes here, very strong diagonals. And people speculate on their purpose, but something that is noted here is you start to see the torso a little bit more from the front. And we're going to move now to Neolithic, which literally means new stone. So this is a time period roughly 4,000 through 1,500 before the Common Era. And this is really when we see the emergence of architecture. So this is following the end of the Ice Age, and that, of course, affected the distribution of the stability of plant, animal, and marine life. And this is when humans leave caves, they develop control over land, resources, and they change the economy and community interactions. So here we have this combination we'll see here of painting, sculpture, with this new kind of emerging art form necessary to wander and settle the earth with, which of course is architecture. So these are a couple of questions to consider as we look at our last few examples here. What are our earliest examples of architecture? And what purpose did early architecture serve? So think about that for a moment. Again, feel free to pause this, and then we will continue by considering that through these examples. Okay, so some of the initial purposes for architecture is, and there are many more examples than the ones we're going to discuss here, but one of the early purposes is to house and memorialize the deceased. Another purpose is to create places for worship and religion. And another important purpose for establishing early forms of architecture is to create environments for settling and permanent residence. So we'll see how all of these examples are employed in these next images we're going to be looking at, and these sites are on your list of images as well too. So our next example here, one of our first examples of a Neolithic settlement is Jericho along the Jordan River Valley. This area underwent a lot of development around approximately 8,000 before the Common Era, and we have examples in our text of remains from approximately 7 through 6,000 before the Common Era. You see that buildings were constructed in rectangular forms of mud and brick, and we have here on the left what may have been revealed as one of the first known defensive towers that was built into the settlement wall, and also is possibly the beginning of monumental architecture. At this site, you have multiple types of images as well too. There were different shrines devoted to women, goddesses, and possible fertility cults evidenced by fertility figures found there. What we see on the right here, also an image from your text, is something found at Jericho, human skulls that have been altered, like this one. So these human skulls were detached from their bodies and reconstructed in plaster with hair that was painted and seashells that were inlaid where the eyes were. So some of the reasons this is significant is this altering of this basically dismembered human skull is that it suggests a belief in an afterlife, possibly. This kind of concept of the survival of the death of the body. So this may hint at some of the spiritual purposes and spiritual ideals of the people who created this. And also significantly, this altering of the human skulls, of course, and kind of emphasizing individual features there. This also marks the tradition of individual portraiture that really persists into our contemporary aesthetic. So now we leave Jordan for Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey, and this site is called Çatalhöyük. And this is one of the first notable urban settlements, over 32 acres, that was culturally advanced and also wealthy due to trade. So between approximately 7,000 through 5,000 before the Common Era, this area was developed and rebuilt, and this reinforced the idea that it was meant as a permanent dwelling place. And this area also shows a transition towards a more agrarian society too, and that relationship with the land. So similar to Jericho, the buildings are constructed of mud and brick with timber frames. The homes where people lived, as you can kind of see here from this image on the left, were adjoined without doors, and people entered through the roofs with ladders. This would have provided a sense of ventilation, of course, much needed, but this entry through the roof may have also given a type of defensive strategy too for inhabitants against people who may have tried to invade by entering that roof. Excavations here show that it was a domestic site as well as a spiritual one. There were many purposes for the structures found at the site. And during this time we see here, there was not a strong separation between the living and the dead, as the deceased were buried beneath places where people lived. So that kind of raises the questions, how do we see these spaces? Are they domestic? Are they sacred? Are they both? So our designation for spaces for architectural sites today is they're very kind of separate. Every site has a specific purpose, but that was not the case with architecture. Of course, going back to Neolithic, you would have burials close to domestic spaces, as well as these spaces being very close to shrines as well too. And at this site, there were multiple shrines found. You have examples in your text here. You have a fertility figure on the right, but also illustrations, recreations here, like the one at the top here. There were shrines with bovine skulls that most likely referenced ideas of masculine potency. And you also had plaster casts of breasts that referenced fertility as well too. So a lot of spiritual significance behind these symbols. And beneath this you see a unique landscape of an actual volcano with rectangular homes in front. So it's not likely that this volcano was really kind of, that this image was documenting an actual volcanic eruption, but this actual volcano would have been seen from this site. But since it was located near a shrine, it most likely had some type of significance because it was located in one of the oldest shrines that was there. So now we move on to our last example, our last image from our list of images. Even though I hope you're reading the chapter, I hope you're enjoying it. Our final image we will be discussing is kind of one of the most famous and recognizable Neolithic examples here, and that is Stonehenge. And here we have an aerial perspective of it. So a couple of questions to think about here. What are some of the theories about Stonehenge? How does it show possible relationships between the living and the afterlife? So think about this for a moment, and of course, feel free to pause this and consider this with more depth. So let's consider a little bit of background on the construction of Stonehenge, which still remains a bit of a mystery for us here. Stonehenge was constructed in over 8 phases over time, and the different types of sandstone and bluestones indicate locations from which the stone was quarried. there are many theories trying to explain the significance of Stonehenge, such as its possible association with Celtic Druids as a ceremonial ground, and also, as you noticed in your text, during the Middle Ages, people were associating it with Merlin too. A lot of different speculative theories, but none of these are truly supported by any definitive evidence because of the lack of the writing systems that we've been able to decipher. Some other theories to keep in mind here, in addition to possible association with Celtic Druids or the fact that this may have been a ceremonial ground, is that it may have been created as a calendar or some type of astronomical device that maps solar planetary movement, possibly for crop planning. But the most current theories about Stonehenge link it to death and burial. So, little vocabulary to consider here. And of course you have more in your text, but I'd like to draw your attention to some terms here like megalithic. And if you're to break down this term, you've noticed that lithic is being used a lot, referencing stone. Mega, of course, you may associate this with something that is, large or very broad here. This literally means it's composed of giant upright stones. So this term just really references the composition, the size, and material of complex megalithic monuments like this here. So let's consider Stonehenge and its relationship to the living. So Stonehenge, and I'll show you another recreation and speculative map based on the site Durrington Walls, which is connected to this. So Stonehenge is associated with this area called Durrington Walls, which would have been what is believed to have been a nearby settlement where people lived. And if you see this kind of recreation here, this plan of Stonehenge and its surrounding settlements, as we see here, there was a passageway that led from this area where the living would have lived here to Stonehenge. You can see here the ceremonial circles of the living. If you look beneath where it says Domain of the Living and find Durrington Walls here, and I'll just kind of point this out as well too. Here's Durrington Walls. You see this interesting passageway, transformation from life to death. And this leads to Stonehenge and what is also referred to as the Circle of Ancestors. So what you see here is you see a strong connection between ideas of life and the afterlife as well too. And you see this actual and conceptual passage to death with the transformation from life to death. And this kind of reminds us of the idea that Neolithic architecture represented maybe cultural views and ideals about the afterlife and used physical form to reinforce that relationship. So think about the conceptual ideas and ramifications between sites, these Neolithic sites such as Stonehenge, even though there is and probably always will be a sense of kind of mystery around the original intent of these sites. We know that there definitely is some association with death, and there have been remains buried beneath Stonehenge. So now let's connect this, and this is always a great question I encourage people to consider. How are these sites, how is everything we see in this course relevant to us now? So what does most of our architecture today have in common with Stonehenge? Okay, so if we look at this here, you can see number 1 here shows you post and lintel architecture. And what this is a post is an upright structure that can serve as some type of wall, and lintel is placed above the posts and can basically serve as some type of roof. And this forms the basis of what we consider one of the most fundamental principles of Western architecture to this day. And if we see here post and lintel architecture, we see an example we'll be looking at later, very exciting chapter on ancient art, ancient Greece. We see with the Acropolis here and the Temple of Athena Nike, another highly influential architectural example from the ancient world. we see that this is using that structure of the post and lintel. As you see this, how it has been elaborated upon, post and lintel. And beneath this, you see the White House, also incorporating post and lintel architecture in its design and construction. So we're going to close this chapter there. And for our next class, we'll see how these ideas about art and architecture are continued through Mesopotamia, also considered to be the cradle of civilization. Please feel free to let me know if you have questions about anything during these audio lectures or anything about the class. Feel free to contact me. Okay, until next time, thank you.